Hi everyone, I'm Kerry Cassidy from Project Camelot and very happy to be here tonight. I have a fabulous guest, Paladin, and we're old friends and we're going to be talking about what's the craziness going on in Washington, D.C. and in the country and around the world, and really the state of play as I titled this. And we're also going to get into some of his latest investigations, assuming we have time, after sort of slicing and dicing the whole Michael Flynn Russia probe and things related to that. So what I'm going to do here is, this is a little different because Paladin is not, well, he's here, but.
And hello everyone, it's good to see the Project Camelot crowd again.
Excellent.
Always good to be here.
Paladin is a forensic financial investigator, and he has been investigating Vegas for ages right now. And on top of that, he is, well, staying tuned into what's going on behind the scenes with the Trump administration and the players. And so he's very good at all that. So I decided to complement the last night's show, which was with Scott Bennett. I would have Paladin on the show tonight to sort of augment all of that and bring his point of view, or a wider point of view in terms of the white hats and so on. So Paladin, go right ahead. If you can introduce yourself briefly for those that don't know who you are.
We have the White Hats Report website. It's whitehatsreport.com, which we started in 2010. A lot of our reports, I think we've put up about 68 at this point, and most of them are about the financial situation in the world. We've talked about the trading programs. We've listed some where we posted some two trading contracts, which is, well, that's too much to get into now. We've talked about that before. My background, I have an accounting degree, a Bachelor of Science degree in accounting. I've got 5 years in the corporate world. Half of that was as an internal auditor and audit manager, and the other half as a financial manager. And then I've been licensed as a private investigator for 33 years. So we started the White Hats Report site in 2010, in late 2010, so we've almost had those reports up for 9 years. And if I could, Kerry, I'd like to kind of just jump on here with what you and Scott were talking about last night, if you don't mind.
I think that'd be great, so go ahead.
Okay, and I think, and maybe everyone knows, but, and I don't know, I think it was sometime in 2015, there was a meeting in the Trump Tower between Dumford, General Dumford, and Admiral Mike Rogers and General Flynn. And I believe Jeff Sessions was there, and that meeting was held with Trump and his two sons. And essentially what that was all about was them approaching Trump to run for president, which of course, you know, the rest is history. And I know you and Scott talked about, you did, Kerry, talked about the military selecting Trump, which of course is obviously accurate. You and I have talked about this a lot. The Navy is heavily involved, which obviously includes the Marines, and you know, Mattis was a Marine and Kelly was a Marine, the Chief of Staff, former Chief of Staff, and of course Dumford, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, is a Marine. So yeah, it's Navy and Marines. And you also talked about Rick Davis and Pol Mol, and about the election and how Hillary had that set up to steal the election. And I just wanted to talk about that just a little bit, if we could, because I know you did several interviews with Rick, and Rick and his people approached us before the election to try to help us, or help him market the Pol Mol app, which we were going to try to get everyone to download so that they could register their vote, so that if there was an issue with the election and the vote count, that would be a ready-made way to dispute it or file, suit in court to challenge the votes. And I believe it was the day after, maybe the day after, or maybe 2 days after the election, Rick Davis called me up and told me the story of how Hillary's people had basically hacked into the server, into the network, and was basically had some AI technology in place to rig the election. And the way he explained that to me is that, and I don't know if everybody knows the process, it's so screwy, it's unbelievable, but the voting machines, it's on a GEMS system, I forget what that stands for, GE, Global Entity Management System or something. But anyway, what happens is your local vote goes through a server, and it actually gets sent to Spain to a company called Scytl, SCYTL. And if you look at their website, in their customers, they have a customer link, and if you go to their customers, the U.S. elections is one of their customers. So what happens is you do your voting at your local precinct, and that vote gets sent to Spain. Those votes get sent to Spain. Spain tabulates those votes, and then they send them back not to the Secretary of State or to the Federal Election Commission, but who? The media. So what happened was the hack, as I understand it from Rick Davis, was that they put in a formula where a certain percentage of the votes that were recorded in each precinct would go to each candidate. And I'm not going to count, the Libertarian Jill, and I forget her last name, and the other one, the other candidates. I'll just give you the example using Trump and Clinton. So in precinct number 1, let's say they had it rigged so that 52% of the total votes would go to Clinton and 48% would go to Trump. In precinct 2, 51 to 49, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you see how that works. Well, from what I understand from Rick Davis, some white hat hackers went in and reversed the fix, and they took that out. And when Rick told me that story, I said, wow, we really need to put this out. And he said, well, yeah, you've got my permission if you want to talk about it. And I said, better yet, why? Because you understand it better than I do. Why don't you write something up for me, and I will include it in one of my reports, which he was good enough to do. And I did include it in one of the reports, and it was actually included in report 57. And there's a section in there, it's a pretty long report, and in that report there's a section called What If. So in that section, if you want to go review that report, in where the What If paragraph is included with the write-up that he gave me to include in that report. And I, being the kind of guy that I am, I included a quote from the Sun Tzu Art of War. And this is from the Tactical Dispositions chapter of the Art of War, because Rick basically considered this judo. And if you know anything about the martial arts, you'll understand what he means by this was judo. But my quote that I added to this was, to secure ourselves against defeat lies in our own hands, but the opportunity of defeating the enemy is provided by the enemy himself. So what that means is essentially they went in and provided the opportunity for us to make sure that the election was done correctly by rigging it, because that's what got the attention of the white hat guys in the first place. And I think, as far as I remember, Rick telling me that the white hats just kind of went in to look around to see what was going on, and they found the rig, they found the program. And so they were actually surprised that when they went in and reversed it, that it wasn't caught, and that they didn't, that Hillary's people weren't sitting around watching this happen real time. So from Rick's standpoint, he said that he thinks that they thought it was already a done deal. Now, if you can all go back and remember, if you watched the election, and I did actually watch it till 3 o'clock in the morning because that was when they finally announced that Trump was the winner. I was watching Fox at one point, and everybody remembers the meltdowns that everybody had, most of the commentators. And I remember there was at one point, Megyn Kelly, because she was still at Fox at that point, went back into their quote-unquote war room to see what was going on. And as the night wore on and the returns kept coming in, and the major states were, Florida and Iowa, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Ohio, which I believe, if I'm not mistaken, were 100 or 110 or something like that electoral votes, which basically was the difference. And so as I'm watching this, I'm thinking Trump's going to win. As those particular states, they finally called it, and I think Pennsylvania was finally the one that put him over the top. It was sort of comical because I didn't know at the time, but it appeared as if they were not obviously expecting Trump to win, and I think part of this had to do with the fact that all the polls showed Trump win, or showed Hillary winning. And I think, 138 or 538 or whatever that guy is. I think they're like 96% chance where Hillary's going to win and all this kind of stuff. And what's so interesting about that is we've got one of our white hats that lives in California knows a pollster. And this pollster conducts polls for candidates specifically. And see, we see these polls that they put out in their public polls. And, there's I just saw one today because all the Democratic candidates are in Iowa. Trump went to Iowa. They did this poll, and 52% for Biden and 48% for Trump. And they poll, there's, what is it, the plus or minus, the, margin of error is like 3.5%, which is totally ridiculous to me. And they polled 707 people. So I don't know how you can draw any kind of a conclusion out of 707 people. But this polling that we were made aware of, our guy knows the person who owns this polling company. He said Trump's winning. Trump is about 60 or 70% everywhere. And he said, so if it's not rigged, if it's not, we don't have issues with the polling or with the voting, then Trump should win pretty handily. And, these guys, when they do the polls, those kinds of polls, that stuff never gets released to the public because this is something that the candidates do. They pay for it. So they can ask whatever questions they want. So they can ask specific questions about specific issues. Excuse me. And if you notice, Trump, how strategic Trump was in where he went and at the end of right before election day, where the trips that he made. And if you know anything about Brad Parscale, a lot of people credit him with Trump's victory because he's his IT guy. And so they were doing heavy polling in various places. And so Trump made strategic stops or campaign stops at the end of the campaign season to specifically hit certain areas that were still in question. And of course, when everybody sort of looks at this now, the armchair quarterbacks look at this now and they say, criticize Hillary. And of course, if she can't blame it on the Russians, and she can't blame it on all these different, I don't know how many excuses she's got at this point. But, a lot of people say, well, Hillary didn't go to Pennsylvania, or Hillary didn't go to Wisconsin or Iowa or wherever it was that she didn't go and do campaign speeches. Well, now we know why Hillary didn't go, because Hillary felt like it was already in the bag because they had this fix in. So, and one other thing I want to add before I'll turn it back over to you, Kerry, is that this Scytl, SCYTL, if you go to their website, it's really a pretty amazing website. You really should go check that out because it's kind of interesting. Talks about paper ballots, or not using paper ballots, the electronic voting. And from what we understand, I bet nobody could guess who funded this company. That's right, George Soros. So anyway, I'll turn that back over to you, Kerry, and we can kind of go on from there.
Okay, well, very good. So that's a good story, and I have to say that I talked about it last night, but for those that didn't see my interview with Scott Bennett, I just want to say that I talked about the fact that I interviewed Rick Davis, and he had told me off the record the same thing he told Paladin, and so then he was killed. He actually died unexpectedly shortly after the election. And I was quite convinced that this was the reason, because he was, in essence, part of the Navy, and that they had, in essence, as I say, hacked the election back from the Hillary camp. And so this is, I know this is very radical for a lot of people to take on board, but it's important. And also, I think it does justice to his memory, actually, to say, and the people that did help behind the scenes. And then you have to ask yourself why. And I understand a lot of people are not big fans of Trump, but it's not Trump per se. So I do want to emphasize that he is on a team, and that team is a group of people that do involve what one might call patriots, for lack of a better word. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't also have links to the Illuminati. And, you know, our takeover of our country goes back many, many years, at least to the Kennedy assassination. Then you can definitely draw a line in the sand and say what happened after that. And they basically vowed that they were never going to allow a free election of any kind to have a person come in that wanted to, number one, get rid of the CIA. And the CIA is basically a rogue agency at this point. It involves two arms, the arm that involves collecting intelligence and the arm that involves what we call clandestine operations. And basically it's also putting out, it's working on both sides of the street all the time. And there's a really good book out there by Fletcher Prouty called Secret Team, if you want to get it on Amazon, and I highly recommend it. I know Paladin has read it. Paladin, you want to talk about that, because Kennedy dissolving, there are some correlations, I guess you might say, between what Trump is sort of doing behind the scenes, I guess to the most part, but to some degree in front of our eyes, is in some areas similar to what Kennedy was trying to do as well. So any comments about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I know you and I have talked about this numerous times about the people involved with setting up the shadow government. Dulles, the Dulles brothers, and our favorite guy, Angleton, James Jesus Angleton, and that started the shadow government, the CIA, back in the late 50s and early 60s. Kennedy wanted to get rid of him, and they had the Bay of Pigs invasion planned. That was planned during the Eisenhower administration and Vice President at that point, Nixon, was in charge of that group. And obviously they were hoping Nixon would get elected, and so then he could continue on with the Bay of Pigs. Well, they ended up doing that anyway. And Kennedy, after that failed invasion, Kennedy realized what the CIA was up to, and so he fired Dulles, he fired Bissell, and he fired Cabal. Now, Cabal, Charles Cabal's brother, was the mayor of Dallas, so 2 years later, you can see the connection there with Dallas. Kennedy said he was going to break up the CIA and scatter it to the winds. And I think, of course, we know that George Bush was involved. Bush came in as the CIA director in the 70s, in 1976 and 77, for just a very short period of time that happened to coincide with the Church Committee hearings when they were reinvestigating the Kennedy assassination. So he was there as a gatekeeper to make sure that none of the information that the CIA had at that point in time would get into the public realm. And of course, they concluded that it was very likely that Kennedy was killed by killed by a conspiracy, because they had acoustics from Dallas that indicated that there were shots fired from more than one location. So, taking that forward, I think that the CIA kind of runs the shadow government, if you will. And if you watch a lot of these movies about the Sea and Navy SEALs and the Green Berets and all these special ops movies, you'll notice that there's always a civilian-looking person or people who are basically running the operation, and they're not military. They're CIA. That's the CIA. So that's the second part, Kerry, that you're addressing when you say there's two parts. There's the information gathering, which is the intel part, which is really what they're limited to. They're not supposed to be taking action. They're just supposed to be a reporting agency that gets intel. But the second part of that, the second side of that, as you mentioned, is the actionable part. And in a lot of cases, they are the ones that run the military operations. And there was a national security memorandum that Kennedy put out that brought all of that back into the military's hands, where the CIA didn't have any involvement. And I know Prouty talks about that in his book, because Prouty was an interesting guy. If you've ever seen JFK, Oliver Stone's JFK, the guy that Donald Sutherland plays, which is, I don't know, Colonel Y or whatever his character is, he meets with Garrison in Washington, and that 15-minute scene is probably the most telling scene of the whole movie. But that character of Donald Sutherland's is Fletcher Prouty.
Right, absolutely. And what I'm doing here is muting myself so we don't have an echo. So in terms of what's happening today, just to bring it back into what's going on, and there's a lot of things down the rabbit hole that I could get into with regard to Prouty, because he was called to Antarctica, and that's just a key to people. This guy was pretty well read in, as is John Kerry, of course, and Antarctica had a role even back then, so that can kind of blow your mind, I think. And of course, you knew during World War II, it all started with Hitler and New Berlin and all of that. So we're talking about a rabbit hole that goes back many years and has lots of different, what you might say is chapters. So, but in terms of what I find interesting is having a view of history at the same time as you watch what is going on and the kind of ops that they are running today to distract people. And so this is the thing that's going on to some degree with this whole Russia probe, no doubt about it, because we are working closely with Russia and have been for many years in what is in essence the Rogue Civilization secret space program, and so on. And there's some interesting documents that came out very recently called the Admiral, I think he's called Rear Admiral Wilson documents, and I put a whole post on my site with a bunch of links and my commentary on those documents. And once again, you're going to see to the stars their hand in that game. And so what I was talking to Scott about was also the fact that a major player in black projects, McChrystal, is behind the scenes setting up, at least giving an address, that's all we know about it, to Flynn, so that he has a place where he can lodge his company, which may be a front company or whatever it is. But nonetheless, this is where a general who was involved with Michael Hastings, I talked about this last night, but for those that weren't there, Michael Hastings is the Rolling Stone journalist whose car engine, Mercedes, jumped out of the car and hit the ground some distance away. From what I understand, he was killed, and it is said that he was hit by a scalar weapon, if I remember correctly. So all of that, it leads us to what's going on with Flynn. Where do you think this is going to lead? And if you can kind of take sort of a flight of fancy, see, because Scott wanted to go down the road of civil war, which is why I made this little banner for you, which has a patriot on it. And so are we going to have patriots save the day? What is going to go on with this country? Because there's so much confusion out there, and there's a lot of nonsense really going on. So do you want to kind of take it from there?
I think what we've got going on is that there was, and I say this, and maybe it's, I say this jokingly, but I think maybe it's truer than I think. But because of the fix they had on the election, they never thought Trump was going to win. So nobody had the foresight to write up the playbook that said, what do we do if, here's what we do if Trump does win. And so what we've seen in some of the disclosures that have been trickling out over the past year and a half regarding the FBI and the DOJ, it appears as if at some point in time, they decided they needed what Strzok referred to in a text message to Lisa Page as an insurance policy. And that is, I think, when the Russia-Trump thing was born. And so that got started, and I remember thinking, I can remember I remember the day that I heard that John McCain was the one who turned over the Steele dossier to the FBI. So essentially what went down there is that they tried to, through Robert Steele, or is it Christopher Steele, created this fake dossier that had all kinds of information about Trump in it. And they started leaking that information, I think, even before Trump was elected. And so the focus was on Russia, if you recall, between the time that Trump was elected, Trump was elected and he took office, that there was a lot of talk about the Russia collusion. And let's not forget, everybody, they did everything they could to keep Trump from taking office between November of 2016 and January of 2017. Remember that Jill, what's her name? I forget, the Libertarian or whatever, the Green Party. She filed to do the recounts. Then, if you recall, the big push to try to convince the Electoral College electors not to vote like they were supposed to vote when they were they have to submit their votes sometime in December. And if you recall the big push there we have even had some attorneys come out and say, well, if you don't vote the way your state's supposed to vote, I will represent you if you get sued free. We have to not forget those things. So they tried everything they could to keep Trump from taking office to begin with. And around this same time, of course, then we have Flynn, who is going to be the Director of National Intelligence, I believe, the DNI, and he was obviously having discussions with the Russians. And, so Comey, as he's basically admitted to in the last month or so, sent his guys over to the White House to try to talk to Flynn. And they, in essence, caught Flynn in maybe some lies or some falsehoods or maybe some stories, and they got him out of there. And I think the reason that they went for Flynn is because they knew Flynn knows where all the bodies are buried. And so they had to go after Flynn first. Now, it's interesting that all occurred early 2017, almost 2 years ago. Flynn eventually pled guilty to lying to the FBI because he's essentially gone bankrupt because of all the attorney fees that he's had to bear to try to defend himself. And he hasn't been sentenced yet. And they keep putting off that sentencing and putting it off and putting it off. And now he's trying to fire his attorneys. And there's a good possibility that basically the way they set that whole thing up, Flynn is that whole thing's going to get overturned, because if he changes his plea, there's a good chance that he's going to get out of that completely. So that's what's going on with Flynn. Now, at the same time, you've got Mueller, you've got Comey being fired, and Mueller then a few days later being appointed as the special counsel to look into the Russian collusion. And of course, Trump, because he made comments about WikiLeaks during the campaign, that gave them sort of ammunition to say, well, Trump was, colluding with Russia. I mean, he said WikiLeaks was, he said he was glad that WikiLeaks was making all those, disclosures about the DNC and all the emails that they got from Podesta. And the thing of it was, of course, we know that, mysteriously, Seth Rich was murdered in Washington, D.C. And Bill Binney he and some of the guys that used to be in NSA have done some investigation on that whole hacking thing, and said that there's no way that, based on the download speed, that could have been hacked. It had to be somebody that was on the inside. So it was most likely Seth Rich who sent him somehow got him to Assange at WikiLeaks. And of course, we know what happened to Assange recently. He's been arrested. And of course, Britain is going to try to hold him over there as long as they can, for whatever reason. I don't know. I mean, I know you guys were talking about that, and I hope that he survives that, because I think eventually Trump will probably pardon him if they can ever get him to the United States. So that's kind of that story, and it's all starting to unravel, because now we have a real attorney general who the DOJ just made an announcement yesterday. Well, they didn't make an announcement. They sent a letter to the House Judiciary Committee describing their investigation into the investigation of the Russian collusion thing. And it looks like that is going to be very broad in scope. And of course, Michael Horowitz, the IG for the Justice Department, has been looking into the FISA warrant things and some of the leaks that were taking place when Trump became president, and since then, as far as classified information. And so it looks like here in the next maybe month or two, or maybe sooner, all that's going to come to a head, and there could be some serious changes in Washington. And Kerry, and I know you know this, we have talked about all the financial crimes that the cabal, the shadow government, the deep state, pick whatever name you want, they're all the same to me. What the financial crimes that they have committed over the years, and everybody is up in arms about it, because it's like, well, why don't they arrest them? Well, now you're seeing why they don't arrest them, because they are being controlled, okay, by those people. And what we're going to find out here shortly, and I hope Dennis Montgomery, if you don't know who that is, he's a NSA whistleblower who basically turned over 47 hard drives and 600 million pages of transcripts of all the spying that the government has been doing on politicians and judges and businessmen. I mean, they were spying on Trump back in 2005. I mean, this stuff's been going on forever. But the information that Montgomery turned over to the FBI included, I think, maybe for 13 or 14 years, and they were spying on Trump back then. They were spying on judges. They were spying on Roberts, the Supreme Court justice. And just a little sidelight story here, back in 2011 or 2012, we at the White Hats got a heads up that there was a reporter in Ohio that had information on how they were blackmailing Supreme Court Justice Roberts. And so we were trying to get that information. And before we were able to get the information, as we were told, Hillary's people came in and purchased it from this reporter who had turned it up. And of course, I just want to remind everybody that when the Obamacare went to the Supreme Court, Roberts was the determining factor on changing that law from a fine, because it was a fine. The fine being the requirement for everyone to buy the insurance, and if you didn't buy it, you were going to be fined. Well, Roberts changed that from fine to a tax. Okay, which he doesn't have that a power to do that. That's legislative branch stuff and not judicial branch. So anyway, Roberts was the deciding factor on that to make that constitutional, because it couldn't have been constitutional if it was just a fine. But if it was a tax, Congress does have the power to tax. And the interesting part was, I don't know if anybody listened to those arguments. I did, and I remember Scalia asked one of the government attorneys, well, if you're going to require us to get insurance, what's next? Are you going to require us to buy broccoli? A typical Scalia comment, right?
Okay.
So, and so what we're seeing here is and I want to wrap this back to what you were talking about, Kerry, in the 1960s. This is the way that they have controlled the politicians, because they blackmail them. They they do the what what Barr referred to as spying. They do this through the intelligence agencies, and then that's how they control the politicians. So that's where we are.
Yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
about to be exposed.
Yeah, I mean, very good. Now, what we haven't talked about along these lines, and we did talk to each other about it, but was kind of, you were talking about the insurance policy, but you didn't kind of go all the way and talk about how Obama keeps getting wrapped into this scenario. And I think that's really bizarre, because they want to lay the blame with the Obama, sort of starting the spying and so on. But all that really does is take the attention away from Hillary and her camp. Obama was really on the way out, and what he did, every other president is equally guilty of. I think you can pretty much guarantee. So, it's they rely on, I guess they're relying on a certain part of the population in the United States as being extremely naive. That's the only way I can see that they get away with some of this rationale. So, do you want to address any of that?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And this goes back to Operation Mockingbird, where the CIA controls the media for the most part. And that's why Trump knows that. And that's why Trump has attacked the media. That's why Trump tweets all the time, because he knows if he relies on the media to report everything, it's going to be distorted. So Trump avoids the media, bypasses the media, and goes straight to the people with the with his tweets. And I think that's I think it's so interesting, because they created the internet to control us, to the social media to control us, because they can download their stories and it goes, everybody retweets and everybody sends the same thing around. So it's really easy for them to get information out to us without putting it in a newspaper, or because some people don't read the newspaper, or putting it on TV because people don't watch TV. But you can bet that everybody has their iPhone, and they're going to get a notification for this and that, and somebody's going to retweet it. So that's the way that they are trying to keep control over this. And Carrie, and I know you know what I'm going to say next, but it's like, once you've taken the red pill, it's hard to put yourself back into a place of unknowing, to look at this sort of objectively and say, well, are they having any effect? Because once you already know what's going on, then you know that all the media lies are just that, simply lies, and it becomes so apparent what they're doing. And so it's really hard to judge that. But yeah, I can't believe it. They are exposing themselves right and left. What we're seeing is a microcosm of what they have been doing when they took over this country after World War II. And it did start after World War II, Operation Paperclip, where they brought all the Nazi scientists over here because they were probably most likely ahead of us in that regard, as far as, and what you said about Antarctica is exactly on point. And so, Hitler's rocket program, they brought over all those guys, and of course that was the guy who headed that whole thing up. Well, that was Alan Dulles, and he would take files of certain, certain Germans. They were trying to decide whether they were going to send them to Nuremberg or send them to the United States. And if Dulles put a paperclip on their file, that meant that they were coming to the United States. So what you're seeing now
You know
today,
what? I never heard that actually. That's where they got the Project Paperclip name.
Yeah,
That's very
yeah,
funny. That's very
yeah,
funny.
because Dulles. If you looked at it, and I know you know this, he spent most of World War II in Switzerland. So he kind of ran things
Yeah,
over there.
actually, so did well, he was also meeting a lot of times with Angleton and
Yes.
and the OSS all the way back to the US from there. And Bern, see, I know Bern, Switzerland. Bill Ryan and I spent time in Bern, so it's quite an interesting city. It does look like a city full of spies, I have to say, even to this day. It may still be.
Well, and they're neutral. Switzerland's always neutral, so that's obviously the safe haven for all the spies to hang out. So that's what Dulles did. Dulles, that's what Dulles's responsibility was to go through all the files, and if he put a paper clip on the files, then he just forwarded those files on to the proper people, and those were the Nazis that they took out of the line to go to Nuremberg and brought them to the United States. So that's where that Operation Paperclip comes from. He essentially put a paperclip on the files of the ones that he wanted to bring here.
Right. So in terms of building what we have now, which is, we have a secret government, a secret space program, all of that goes back to the days of the Nazis, to their dealings with various ET races, specifically the reptilians in Aldebaran, beings from Aldebaran, as well as, of course, the William Tompkins material that relates to some beings from what we call the Pleiades. And so that's the secret space program. In other words, what is interesting about this whole story is that what we have is now a rogue civilization, in essence, underground bases, bases on the moon and Mars. The whole thing branched from the time of the Nazis and through obviously recruiting the Germans over here from paperclip, and a certain philosophy that sort of continues to this day. And of course, I've interviewed Michael Shrimpton. I don't know if you've listened to any of those interviews, Paladin, but he is an English barrister, a very interesting guy who's pretty much deep in with regard to the intelligence agencies, and talks about the German DVD as being very active. It's called the DVD today. It was called the Abwehr back in the day with Hitler, and all of that. So they have infiltrated the British, which is where we get some of the problems that we're having with Britain and America right now. And this also gets into why Trump's visit with the Queen was so important, which also has to do with them going slightly rogue with regard to Huawei, taking a Huawei equipment, refusing to sever that relationship, when in fact that will allow the Chinese to piggyback into our secret, NSA files, etc. The whole AI rollout, which is happening behind the scenes right now. And I just heard a whole meeting that Motley Fools, it's an investing thing you might know about, but they did a special presentation on the secret rollout to do with Apple computer and what they're looking at. And it's quite fascinating. So, they're trying to get investors into the whole new what is in essence the Terminator, Skynet scenario. And so I understand that we talk about these dramas going on, but if people could understand that behind the dramas that involve personalities are very real issues that have to do with our future and how it's going to roll out, who's in charge of that future, and so on. So this is where the following this closely can also tell you who the players are. When I tell you that this is in mainstream, when I see there's a link to the formation of the Flynn companies back to McChrystal, and that McChrystal was involved heavily in black projects, we know there's a trail there, then that goes deep into what we call the deep state, if you want to start there. Okay, that would be the surface level of the secret government. So there are players involved, which has to do with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and whether or not and how far someone like Trump is even read into all of that and so on. And then what they're told because, need to know and all of this kind of thing. So the whole thing is an incredible sort of can of worms, if you will. We are in a strange juncture with regard to a possible, some think, a civil war, and I am curious what your thoughts are on that score.
Well, just to kind of hit on what you were saying there with the black projects and the deep state. One of the things that came out of World War II was the Bretton Woods Conference, which they all got together and tried to figure out how they were going to go forward. We had all of Europe that was basically, bombed out. They had to redo infrastructure. They had to do redo roads. I mean, this was all through Europe. So they put their heads together, and this is when they came up with the trading programs. And as you know, we've talked about several times that these trading programs were used to not only rebuild Europe, rebuild the occupied territories, if you will, that were split between us and Russia, but it also was how they came up with the funding for the black projects, as you well know. And I know you've spoken to their former general counsel of Pure Heart, as I have, and he's told us, that technology that they had was 10,000 years in advance, and that's what a lot of the trading program, where a lot of the trading program money goes to, is the black projects. And you can talk about MJ12 and all those things that are going on there, but I think that that's the origin of everything that we see. And in my opinion, it actually goes back to the 1930s when Smedley Butler was, there was a group, he described him, I think, as a group of industrialists or businessmen who were trying to take over the United States. And so they enlisted him as a military person to help, and he went before Congress and testified about the plan, which sort of blew it up. So I've always thought that had some connection to Hitler because, as you know, Bush's Union Bank was suspended for under the Trading with the Enemy Act in 1942 because they were financing Hitler's war. After we weren't into Europe yet, but we were fighting with the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. So all of this, I think we have to look at it in total. That a lot of the stuff that we see today started 60 years ago after World War II. And I know that you've been on this for a long time on a different parallel than what I have. I've kind of been above surface, you've been below. But as we always talk about, we see the stuff that's above surface, but we don't know what's going on below the surface. And that's always one of the keys here that, we really don't know about. But I think most of this that we've seen, the foundation was laid after World War II to what we see today, and the trading programs have a lot to do with it. Now, as far as the Civil War goes, I don't know if we're going to get to that point because, the guys, we've sat around for years and talked about how is this going to work, the scenario of the disclosure from the standpoint of how are they going to disclose? How are we going to bring this out to the people as far as what has been going on, that their congressmen and their senators have been controlled. They are owned by the cabal, because you have to look at this as the politicians are there just temporary. But these families, the elite families, the bloodline families, if you will, they want to have power for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So their plans have to do with keeping their family in control of a certain segment of the business sector or society. The Rothschilds are a good example of the banking sector, where they've been basically in control of the banking sector all over the world for maybe 250 to 300 years. So I think this is what they're looking at. Now, we've always been told that they're going to roll this stuff out gently. They're going to roll it out very slowly because they're concerned about how the people are going to react. And I've always been one of the advocates in the minority that says just put everything out there at once and let everybody deal with it. And I think that there is a concern that this will create riots, this will create chaos, which will then affect the financial markets, which is something that they really don't want to happen. So at this point, I think it will be a slow roll. I will be very surprised. I'll tell you what I think as far as a civil war goes. I think if they try to impeach Trump, I think if they would try to assassinate Trump or assassinate Trump, I think that would start the civil war. But I'm not sure that arresting, arresting, the McCabe's and the Strocks and the Pages and the Comeys and the Clappers and the Brennans, I'm not sure that's going to create it. Now, I think that they will maybe try to instigate some unrest through, Soros is very good about funding these kinds of organizations, Antifa and Black Lives Matter and some of those groups, to where they're going to come out and riot in the streets. But I don't see us going to a civil war, and maybe that's more wishful thinking than it is anything else. But I think if they would do something to Trump, that is more of a possibility than if they don't.
Okay, well, fair enough. And I don't know either, although I have had, and I look at these things as possible visions or dreams of possible timelines, not necessarily timelines that are going to happen, but I have seen a civil war in this country. And we did interview people along the lines of that. Duncan O'Finian was one in particular, a super soldier who came out early in Project Camelot, talking about his whole training as a super soldier, his skills. He was a psychic super soldier, and he talked about seeing the future in terms of rivers of fire. And we do know that there are, in essence, potentially rivers of fire coming from the methane that's entered the waters of the Gulf and also going up through the rivers. So there is reason to believe that some of what he thought could happen. And then there are, we have impending things that have to do with, and I'm not going to say global warming, but I am going to say in terms of planetary changes that are naturally happening with this planet as we go through a certain part of the solar system, etc. And some people may even want to attribute some of that to a planet X or the passing of what may be a mini solar system in essence or not. And I interviewed Andy Lloyd recently. He's still kind of on the trail of that, and there are various points of view on that. So what I'm saying is that we're looking at that. Now, we are also, and have been told in Project Camelot by our whistleblowers through the years, and this is going back really 14 years at this point, to where they were talking about an EMP that would be self-administered. Of course, that won't be the party line. They'll probably say it came from North Korea or it came from Iran or whatever, and maybe that's going to be the false flag that launches a war. I don't know. I do know that we are looking at a very unstable future, and then there's the whole financial changeover that has never happened, and whether or not that is going to happen anytime soon. It doesn't seem intelligent to turn this place into chaos, which is what a sort of the rough waters of a financial sort of drastic change could do. But a movement onto a gold-based, I guess they're saying a gold-based currency. I don't know where you're at with that nowadays, but this is the kind of thing that people talk about. And I was warned by a behind-the-scenes very highly placed financial guy who actually told me he's going to call me or let me know. I think I'm only going to get like 48 hours notice or something. So I don't know if I'll be able to broadcast something like that or not. That something's going to happen in terms of the financial system, that they're way overdue and that this is the year. Now, I don't know if the status has changed on that or not. I do know this whole battle with Huawei is a lot more important than people realize. So as much as they want to watch the drama of possible impeachment coming from the Democrats, because everything is, it's like Jordan Maxwell says, you know, the bird has two wings, and it's one bird. And so Russia is considered one wing, and we are considered the other wing, in case you're wondering. And this is how the Illuminati view it. This is how it's been orchestrated, and this is actually how the CIA run their operations as well. Two wings again, right? And so it's very interesting when you see the CIA actually fighting amongst itself, coming up with completely contradictory testimony with great, backing evidence and so on and so forth. And yet it's all done by the same agency. And this is also what is happening now with so-called disclosure. So they want to own the game. And I think part of the problem that we're having as humans is them owning the game in that sense, and whether or not we can take back the game into our hands, and whether or not the big controversy, of course, is whether Trump and the people who are backing him. And I think that's so important. I just don't understand where people, I have somebody who's wrote to me, they want to see someone kill Obama. I mean, like, the guy is like gone. I mean, he's not a factor. He's not even a player to the degree that Hillary, and Bill are. And he never was, actually. So, but people don't recognize this. They don't understand that Hillary's server was given to her by the secret space program. It was part of her job. They don't understand she's working for someone. It's not a war of personalities. These people report to higher ups, okay? And it's the higher ups that get completely out from under and ignored and get away with, in essence, murder, literally and figuratively. And so, anyway, Paladin, your expertise is financial. I wanted to ask you, what do you think about this future for the financial system and how it may play out?
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because that's sort of gotten, and you and I have talked about this privately for years about the direction in which it's been heading, and it all started several years ago with the breakaway 5 companies that formed the BRICS alliance to break up that petrodollar of the U.S. And so now we're seeing China quickly becoming the second most powerful economic entity in the world compared to us, and we're number 1 and they're number 2, and they are fastly approaching our numbers as far as output and GDP and all the rest of it. And as you know, there was a proposed meeting several years ago in London with the Chinese and the between the West and the East, because the Chinese wanted to sit down and talk about a new financial system, and the Rothschilds refused their seat at the table. So therefore, the Chinese said, "Okay, we're gonna do our own thing then." And so here we are in 2019, and I just recently heard that we are looking at a slow rollout that's going to be taking place. And the timeline they're telling me now, and I just got this a couple of weeks ago, is 2020, after the election in 2020. So that's an interesting timeline. Now, I think one of the things is going to have to take place prior to that is either the dismantling or the destruction or the total annihilation of the Federal Reserve. And one of the things that's always been an issue with this changeover, if you will, is who's going to eat the debt? Who is going to swallow the debt? Who is going to be stuck with the debt? Because the original plan was the one world, one government, one world, one world government, one world religion, one bank, one currency. That was the plan, and what they were going to do with these derivatives and all the nonsense that was going on 10 to 15 years ago in the financial markets. That was so that they could spread that debt out over the whole world, and at some point in time, the banking institutions were going to call in that debt. They're saying, hey guys, we got all this debt, you're going to have to pay it. And so what they were going to do then was they're going to rob all of our pension funds, they're going to rob all the institutions to get that debt. So they were basically going to get that debt paid off by whatever liquid assets still remain, and then they were going to take the system down, then they were going to bring it back up. We're not going to have all these different currencies, we're just going to have one currency. So getting back to your original question, I think what we're looking at here is we're looking at a changeover to an asset-backed system. Now, the information, that I've gotten is that it has to do more with not necessarily just gold, but it has to, because as you know, gold is not, they don't just get gold out of the ground, they make it, the alchemists can make it. So what they are doing is they're trying to do an assessment of natural resources. For example, if you're in Iraq or you're in the Middle East, then it has to do with, your oil reserves will count. So it's more or less going to be an asset-backed system as I understand it. So it's not necessarily just going to be gold, but if you have a lot of gold, like the Chinese have been accumulating gold for a lot of years recently, but if you go back to the Silk Road, the Chinese have been accumulating gold for centuries and centuries and centuries. So therefore, that's what we're looking at now. Recently, I don't know if you've been following Trump and the Federal Reserve, but when the Federal Reserve, of course, while Obama was president, we had this quantitative easing BS, which basically was this: let's just pump as much money as we can into the system because we're all about to go broke, and the timing is not right to take the system down yet. So now, after Trump was in office for a few months, the Fed started raising the rates, and of course, Trump got his tax cuts through and started cutting the regulations. So the economy started picking up. The jobless, they're still talking about, we haven't had this low unemployment since 1969, and there's more people working than ever before, and all those good positive signs for the economy. And then the Fed started raising rates. Well, Trump immediately got all over the Federal Reserve. I mean, he came out and said, stop it. You're going to kill you're going to kill the recovery here. You're going to kill the financial well-being of the United States. And Trump knows that if the United States becomes stronger again financially, that helps us compete with China. Now, so I think we're looking at that. I think we're looking at that at some point in time in the near future. And in the near future, I'm going to say within the next 12 to 18 months, maybe sooner. But I think one of the things that Trump's trying to do right now, if you notice, is he's going through and he's trying to realign the trade imbalances. Okay. And China is the big one. And if they get that trade imbalance, they get the tariffs, they get all that stuff worked out with China, that could then be the trigger point to then put a new financial system in place, because I don't think you're going to be able to do that and it survive unless you have those trade imbalances between the different countries, unless you have those more in balance. So I think that's one of the things that Trump is doing with China. And I think once you see that get into place, then we might see that come about a lot sooner. And I have a bet with one of our mutual friends who lives in Chicago that the Federal Reserve will be no more by the time Trump leaves office, either in 2020 or 2024. And so, that's the way I see it. Now, of course, you always know there's different timelines that we could be talking about here. And of course, getting back to your Civil War question, one of the things that those of us who are on the right side of this, we don't know what the other side is willing to do if they're going to lose power, because when we sit around and we discuss these kinds of things on a philosophical basis as far as a what if and a what if, what are they going to do? What are they willing to do um, before they completely lose power? How crazy are they willing to get? And that could bring in some very, very difficult times for us, using, whatever assets, whatever resources they have at their disposal.
Okay, well, yes, and I think there's no doubt about that. I would say that it's very possible that, at least according to the timelines that we have been told about, again at Project Camelot for many years, there have been certain sort of milestones on those timelines, and those are big sort of ticket items. And one of them is war with Iran, that is actually leads to war with China. So we do see this whole thing with the border in California erupting, and I believe that has everything to do with China and Chinese troops, not actually immigrants from Mexico, although the immigration from Mexico could have something to do with the gray human hybrid program that has been underway in spades down in South American Mexico, which people are not aware of, some people. So there, I know this gets into sort of it's almost an X-Men scenario, believe it or not, and people aren't kind of prepared for that. But we have to look at the future, not just things in terms of all the way they always have been. There's a reason why those X-Men movies are quite accurate in my view. When you look at the future of humanity, and when you look at the chemtrails and the nano and the chemtrails that has been going into our food and water, the rollout of 5G and all of that. Now, when you're talking about the financial system, you also have to get into the financial AIs. And as you say, we don't know where this could lead, and we do know what's logical, or perhaps what we might talk about as being logical, but it may not be what's actually going to happen when you bring the AIs into this whole scenario going forward in the future. And of course, the battle with over Huawei has an undercurrent that actually has to do with a possible war with China. I of course don't want war. I don't think anyone does, but I do think that they are planning. You said, what will they do if they don't get what they want? Well, my understanding is they want war. That's actually how they've always managed to take control, is to get people on sort of more of a, well, first of all, patriotism, some kind of false patriotism having to do with, rah-rah one country over another here on planet Earth, when the real opponents to our livelihood as humans, of course, from my point of view, is off-world and infiltrating us, and possibly down in Antarctica and so on. So what we're really talking about is a war scenario that could unfold, and that's why I was relating about the possible EMP situation. Now, I don't know if I can remember her name, but a woman that was head of the DHS, who resigned many years ago, she actually said in her resignation speech, and you probably know who I'm talking about, and she basically said we're going to have in the future an EMP. She basically said that in her resignation speech to the world, which was very interesting to me, because it coincided with at least one of our whistleblowers, and possibly others. So when we look at the future, it's easy if you try to just reduce things down to the World War II level, but we're not even having wars. I mean, actually, logically speaking, we don't even need boots on the ground in the same way. This is, again, more or less a distraction, because we now have weapons that we could conduct a war that would last, at least according to Mark Richards, as the alien wars do, even off planet, which could last 5 minutes. It could last 10 minutes. In other words, a scalar weapon or a particle beam weapon, this kind of technology is way beyond what we're used to and conditioned to, obviously. And so bullets is not really where it's at. And it may be that actually any kind of war is an old school concept, because we're fast approaching a galactic society and so on. So I know there's a lockdown on knowledge, and the people tend to think about things, especially if you read, I know, pay attention to the newspaper and to the games that they're playing. But I also want to say that it's interesting because one of the things that, if you look at the Trump administration, that they're doing, and they seem to be doing, is they do not, they kind of follow the art of war, if you will, the book, The Art of War, Sun Yat-sen, because it's basically saying, you don't come at your enemy sort of full on. You basically do it in a stealth type of manner, which is what Huawei is, of course, all about, and from the Chinese side of the equation. And so you could look at the way that the Illuminati deal with the people at this point is also stealth. It's also not coming necessarily at your face. When they do send something to your face, it's usually a distraction so you don't see what they're really doing. And I recently let people know there's this Harvard study that came out, and I sent it around. I tweeted it and Facebooked it and everything. So you might have seen it if you are on my Facebook and all of that. And it basically said at Harvard, the scientists have now figured out how they can predict human behavior, and they're using microwave radiation that's linked up with, obviously, 5G. So then you have to look at the Minority Report, the Tom Cruise movie, and understand that this was always the plan, that they don't just want to surveil us, they want to predict what we're going to do next. And that they have a number of reasons for wanting to do that. Also because they recruit their future soldiers, if you will, their super soldiers from our ranks. Okay, so they have to anticipate, what are the young people going to be thinking? What are they going to do if you try this, if you try that, and so on. So it's a big game, and I kind of feel like, in some ways, that people are paying too much attention to this war of personalities when it's not really about that. In order to stay alive right now, the Navy, the part of the Navy that backs Trump, and there may be other sections of the militaries as well, that have even allowed him to get this far, okay? Regardless of whether you think what you think about him, whether you like him or you don't, you have to look at who's backing him, who's making this possible. He's a showman. We even read his chart. He's a Gemini. It's all there. He's used to dealing, with mob bosses and all of that. He's doing a job, but he is not the real show. Okay, the real show is what's happening behind the scenes, and this is what you need to be paying attention to. We can read some of the surface signs and then decipher where they're really going with things. But it is really fascinating. It's a fascinating study. It's a fascinating time to be alive. Paladin, I know I'm keeping you for a while, but I'd like to actually make a transition to have you report, at least to some degree, on your investigations into Vegas, because all the evidence that I've seen and heard about leads me to believe that that was an attempted coup d'etat in our country, and that it was tantamount to 9/11, and that nobody seems to have gotten the memo, except a few people, obviously you and your researchers, and some other people, obviously behind the scenes. I have told John Lear, I interviewed him on stage, and I told him that I was told, if you talk about that, if he talks about it, because Lear lives in Vegas, and he's often got his hand on the pulse of some secret stuff behind the scenes. for a variety of reasons, which I've talked about. And basically, the fact is that you could get killed if you talk about it. But you're a very brave individual, and your white hats are very brave, and the people that are trying to follow this out. So do you want to talk about Vegas to some degree, at least update us on what's happening with your investigation?
I will, but I would like to ask you a question, and this is something that I've forgotten to ask you when we've talked in the past. But if you will, and if you don't want to go into it, that's okay. But I am curious about what you've heard about Trump's Space Force.
Well, the space, I mean, this actually, I'm planning to do a broadcast if I can figure it out tomorrow. And I have another show tomorrow night, so I don't know if I'll get it in. But it does have to do with this recent Admiral Wilson sort of group of documents that basically say MJ-12 is real, that the secret space program is actually real to some degree, and that they've been reverse engineering, crashed alien technology, at least since the 1990s, because the documents come from like the 90s. But the way they're releasing them, it's somewhat problematic, and there's a lot of sides to that. But in terms of the Space Force, this is where it gets into a kind of a disclosure that the president is part of, even though people don't even recognize it. So saying you're going to have a Space Force is that you already have, like we already have one. So this is a way of throwing them sort of the weight over that direction, and sort of it's also signaling to the rest of the world that technologically we're going in a certain direction that we're capable of. And it also has to do with the next field of battle, if you will. So the fields of battle are not going to just be here on Earth anymore. And they aren't. And of course, Ronald Reagan knew this with Star Wars, right? So from my point of view, of course, we have known about Space Command, and Mark Richards considers himself part of Space Command, for those of you who followed those interviews. And I have other members who have, behind the scenes approached me that work for Space Command, and so on. So Space Command is a reality. It is operational, and it's a very important arm of our military, if you will. But it was never talked about. They don't, they're really in a bind, like between a rock and a hard place, because disclosure is so difficult at this juncture. They have basically created like a curtain. So this Wizard of Oz, where people live in this, fantasy land like Dorothy or something, and they have to wake up and realize that that's not the reality. And how do you tell them when you've basically programmed them for so many years to believe one thing, and to believe a fantasy world? And how do you break it to them without them kind of running down the street, going crazy, and also trying to lynch you for lying to them? Because the technology behind anything that would involve Space Command, think about it, involves technology that we might call free energy or 0-point energy, or it might be powered by the sun, or it might be, there's a lot of neutron. Mark Richards talks about the neutron stars. There's a lot of different kinds of energy out there, and I do shows on this subject from time to time. So that's my answer to you, is that it already exists, but it is an attempt at disclosure. Nobody, very few people think of it that way, but it is. It's kind of, it's like, I don't know, like if you had an analogy, like if I had, let's say I had a dog in my closet, and the dog has been living in my closet for all these years, and then one day I say to someone who's coming to visit, oh, what if I get a dog and I'm going to keep him in my closet? You can come and visit him. And the person might say, oh, great. Yeah, I'd love to meet your dog. And they'll think that the dog just started living in my closet. I mean, the Jews that were hiding during World War II. I mean, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about a hidden society, a hidden civilization that's going to the moon and Mars. I know, people think, look, there's so much evidence out there. I can hardly talk to people that aren't already there. Do you know what I'm saying? They can't bring this themselves to understand this. But the nature of reality is nothing like people think it is. So you have to start there. So I know it's kind of a roundabout way of answering your question, but if you just want to say point blank, it's disclosure. It's a way of moving the ball down the field. It's not going very far, right? But at least now, if Trump announced it, what did he, at the beginning of his term, which he basically did, then in another, let's say he gets another term, then another 2 to 4 years, they can build it up to a certain place. And then when they try to trot out some of their technology, you won't say it happened overnight. You know what I'm saying? You'll say, oh, well, it's been going on for 3 or 4 years. We know they started it around the time when Trump announced it. This is for people who want to believe that there wasn't anything first. I mean, it's ludicrous. We have satellites. We're going. We've been going into space for so long. It's just that it's so hidden. It's total absurdity, really. It's like a lockdown on consciousness, but it's something. So it is a kind of disclosure. That's my answer for you. Now, so can you talk about Vegas at all, or if you want to make comments about your thoughts on that, that's cool too.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, when I first heard Trump announce the Space Force, I thought, okay, we are going down that road to disclosure. Although, I mean, we already know that there's a lot of things out there that hasn't been made public yet, and I just thought it was fascinating that seems to be part of the start of the disclosure process. And again, when you think about that part of the disclosure, and earlier we were talking about disclosing, the deep state and the shadow government and the cabal. I mean, the cabal and the deep state and the shadow government are a grain in the sand, and the disclosure about the, off-worlders and everything else that's been going on for a long time is like a great big beach. So it's an island compared to the two. So, I just thought it was interesting. It hasn't gotten much. It really hasn't gotten much play from the media as I thought maybe it would have. And so I just wondered what your thoughts were. But yeah, your Mark Richards interviews are among my favorites. So I think anybody who hasn't listened to those interviews needs to, because there's a lot of good information that comes out of there. And of course, the Dulcie story is one of my favorites anyway. Okay, I'll get into Vegas a little bit. I think, you and I have talked about this, and I did a show with you early on in that process. I think maybe in November of 2017, and at that point, we kind of did the 1,000 mile view, where we were talking about the symbology and the numerology that was involved with Vegas. And so it's kind of interesting now that in a lot of the research and a lot of the investigations that we're doing, we sort of come back across some of those things as we're looking at the fine details. You pull yourself back and you see sort of how those details fit into the big picture. One of the things that I think has been interesting is it seems like there is a sort of a turn or a new direction that this whole thing is going, because I know you're aware that Mandalay Bay or MGM actually sued the victims. And that was all based on the Safety Act, which basically is, that this was a follow-on to the foundation that they laid with the Patriot Act in 2001. And the Safety Act basically says that if you come and get certified by the DHS, you're a security company, or you're any kind of a company or entity that's related to security, that if you are providing that security to a client and an incident occurs that's deemed to be a terrorist act, then you are limited in your liability because you've been certified by DHS. So that was the whole thing with MGM when they came out and sued the victims. They cited the Safety Act. Well, it was kind of first of all, it was kind of a surprise to everybody that they would take that kind of an aggressive approach and actually sue the victims. The the people who are victims of this whole thing, they would actually would have the gall to sue them, but they wanted to get ahead of it from a legal standpoint, and they wanted the Safety Act to be foremost in everybody's minds. So so the Safety Act essentially says that the DHS secretary for the Safety Act to apply and therefore limit MGM's liability in this whole situation, that the DHS secretary has to deem it a terrorist act. Okay. And of course, I know that, ISIS claimed responsibility early on, and then Lombardo came out and said, no, there was no connections with ISIS. And Rouse came out, the FBI special agent in charge in Las Vegas, said, no, there's no connection to ISIS. And so then, here we are almost 2 years later, going on 2 years later, and it's still up in the air. And now MGM, in their first annual report after the incident that came out in March of 2018, in their annual report, as a corporation, you are supposed to disclose any kind of extraordinary items that may cost you money. In other words, something that's not normal to your business. If you have something that you think you need, like a lawsuit, you need to start, reserving money to pay for that lawsuit if you think you're going to lose. And so the SEC requires you to disclose those situations so that the shareholders are aware of it. Well, in MGM's initial annual report after the incident, which was issued March 30th, I believe, 2018, they basically said, hey, shareholders, don't worry about this. We've got insurance to cover it. And not only do we have insurance to cover whatever payments that we may have to make to the victims, our insurance also covers all of the expenses for the attorneys and collateral expenses that we will incur in relation to defending ourselves. Okay, so you kind of read that and shook your head and thought, boy, that's kind of strange. So then about 3 or 4 months later, I believe it was July of 2018 is when they then sued the victims. MGM sued the victims and cited the Safety Act. And it's like, oh, okay, that's what they meant in their annual report. Well, so just recently, a couple months ago, they had to make a disclosure to the SEC. And it looks like maybe that MGM is starting to change their tune a little bit, because now they have estimated that I believe that their liability could be somewhere between $730 to $800 million, and that their insurance would pay up to $751 million. Now, I don't know if that relates to the Safety Act or not, but DHS has not come out and termed this to be a Safety Act violation, a terrorist act where the Safety Act would kick in. And if that doesn't occur, then MGM could essentially end up being more liable for a lot more money than $800 million, at which their insurance probably would cover some of that, but I'm not sure how that, I don't know. I'm not familiar with their policy, so I don't know how that would work. But anyway, not too long after that announcement came out by MGM, we see I believe it was the UK Daily Mail over in the UK comes out with an article, and they come out with a YouTube video of 2 minutes of Varson and Hendricks, basically Hendricks being on the 31st floor. And I don't know how familiar you are with that, but Varson and Hendricks were two Metro police officers who were at Mandalay Bay at the time that the shooting began, and they were down in the security office because they had gotten a call to come and deal with some prostitutes that were at Mandalay Bay. So they happened to be there when the shooting started. So they were essentially, if you will, the first officers on the scene, and they went up to the 31st floor. So the UK Daily Mail came out with a video, body cam worn video, a 2 minute, I think it was 2 or 2.5 minutes, something like that, of Hendricks being in the hallway in floor 131 and not advancing up to the 32nd floor. And in the body cam video, you can hear the shots being fired. And Hendricks he goes so far down the hallway and then he stops and he doesn't go any further. Okay, so um, that's coincidental. And then we hear now, just recently, we get word that Hendricks has been fired from Metro, has been relieved of his duties, and this sort of coincides with that guy down in Florida, the officer who didn't go into the Parkland, who didn't go in and stop the shooting at the Parkland shooting in Florida. He just got charged criminally with negligence or whatever. And so, anyway, what it's starting to look at it, there could be a crack in the armor between the perceived alliance between Metro and MGM, where MGM may now, because it looks like the Safety Act may not limit their liability, that they're going to start maybe gently pushing Metro out in front of that bus, saying Metro has got some liability too. So that's been an interesting development that has just occurred within the last month. Another interesting lawsuit that's going on currently that nobody really is reporting on is the fact that the media, I don't know how many people are aware, anybody that's listened to some of our YouTubes would know, but the media immediately the next morning sued or requested from Metro all kinds of evidence, all kinds of information on the shooting relating to the Nevada Public Records Act, citing the Nevada Public Records Act that you've got to release all this information. Well, Metro fought it, and consequently, Metro lost, and the judge ordered Metro to start releasing evidence. Okay, so that took place, I believe, in early 2018. Well, Metro ended up filing an appeal in the court. They appealed that ruling. And so in the meantime, as this appeal is going through the legal process, and I know this is probably boring people to death, but as this is going through the process, Metro then started releasing the evidence that they were supposed to release per the judge's orders in the original case, according to the Nevada Public Records Act. Well, the media is looking at these evidence releases, and there's body cam footage, and there's helicopter footage, and there's witness statements and police statements, and there's 911 calls and dispatch calls and dispatch logs, and all this information that's been coming out on a weekly basis, starting I think in June or July, or I think it was before that, maybe April of last year. So as this is coming out, the media are looking at these releases of information of this evidence, and they're saying, wait a minute, you guys aren't even complying with the original court order. There is more information that you're supposed to be giving us that you're not giving us. So that lawsuit is still in play. And what's interesting there is that it's a group of media companies, and because I think it's in Las Vegas, the Las Vegas Review-Journal is sort of taking the lead on this. I'm sure that they are the ones who, the other media companies are probably sharing in the expenses for the attorneys to fight this. But, the little twist in this whole thing is, I used to complain because it's like, okay, why is this body cam footage coming out and nobody is reporting on the inconsistencies with what the Metro has put out as their report, and the evidence that they're putting out does not support their report. It does not support that, okay, the evidence that they're releasing. Well, come to find out that the media is complaining about that. You're not supposed to be redacting certain things. We're supposed to know what you're not releasing to us. You're supposed to give us a list, and all these various things Metro is fighting. And the interesting part is that Sheldon Adelson is the owner of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and of course we all know how much money he gave Trump for the election. So those two developments from the legal standpoint is very interesting. Now, I know a lot of people have stopped watching or looking at Vegas probably a long time ago, maybe after the Metro came out with their report in August of last year, and the FBI came out with a report in January that was, the long-awaited FBI report was 3 pages long, which, was just baffling to everybody. And it was, from the behavior analysis unit, they were supposed to give us a motive for why Paddock did all this. And the interesting part was that I don't think there was anything new in that 3 pages of behavioral analysis report that we had already heard from either Lombardo or Rouse in their news conferences. So it's very interesting the direction in which this seems to be going. It seemed to be going pretty much down a certain path, and now with this stalling of maybe the Safety Act kicking in here and the DHS not coming out with declaring this as a terrorist act, it seems like this lawsuit may be going sideways, and it looks to me like possibly MGM is starting to say, well, you know what, if our liability is going to be more than what we originally thought it was based on the Safety Act, maybe we better bring in some more parties. And it looks like Metro is going to be the first party that they're going to bring into this.
Okay. So yeah, I thank you for all of that. I think a lot of people may be mystified if they haven't actually followed your work. And I do want to say that you have a YouTube channel, and from time to time you are making videos that cover like more detail, the kind of detail you're sort of hinting at here, and so that people can kind of backtrack and get more into all of the inconsistencies in what happened in Vegas. I guess what I'd like to, and we have been going for quite some time, so we do want to wrap this up, but I'd like you to look at it, sort of stand back, and if you can sort of project into the future at all with regard to Vegas, does it appear that it's going to stay like a mishmash, and it's never going to be, there's never going to be any revelations in terms of, we already know the Paddock didn't die and that evidence has come out, but nobody pays attention. I mean, it's like a lot of false flags, I guess. If people aren't paying attention, they don't even know that these things are false flags. The trouble is, if you can't learn from the past if you don't pay attention to it, So, any thoughts about this? Because we had like a major, what in essence turned out to be a kind of a battle in one of our major cities, and I do wonder whether or not it also had to do with an attempt to do something to the financial system that hadn't been done yet, or wasn't moving along the way they wanted it to, or whatever. In other words, do you have theories of where this is going to go in the future? And then we'll wrap up.
Well, that's really hard to say, because there was information that came out a few months ago that indicated that some of these arrests that we've all been waiting for, and some of these sealed indictments that we've all heard about, include some culprits that were involved with the Vegas shooting. And Trump, it was interesting because Trump tweeted that it's a miracle that more weren't killed, and the word miracle was in quotations, as if Trump was making a sarcastic, he was referring to that sarcastically. So, as far as the way this is going at this point, what I would say is I don't think it's going the way they wanted it to go at this point in time, given the fact that I think there were a lot of things, or a few things, that went wrong with what the original plan was. So therefore, they've had to try to, clean it up as best they can and get the most out of it as they possibly can. And I don't think that now seems to be in jeopardy because of what I just said. As far as the financial goes, what this does basically, if they were able to get the Safety Act invoked here, so that the insurance company would basically make Mandalay Bay or MGM whole on this whole situation, what that basically says to everybody out there is, hey guys, if you get this terrorism insurance and you contract with security agencies who are approved by the DHS, if you have a terrorist operation in your facility, guess what? Your liability is going to be limited, and your insurance will take care of it, and it's a boon for the insurance agencies, which is then the insurance industry, which is essentially part of the financial system. So, from that standpoint, that would be a big shot in the arm, because what that shows is, just like Silverstein got paid what, double or triple when the Twin Towers fell because he had insurance. And so, what that does is, it looks like the insurance companies had to pay out, but, we all know the financial people have more money than than anybody. I mean, they have so much money, it's not a big deal. Although it sounds like a whole lot of money, it's not that much money to them. But just think about the new business that it will bring into them in the way of insurance premiums for terrorism insurance. So I think that's one effect that it may have on the financial system. Beyond that, I'm not really sure, because I really think that something bigger was planned for Vegas, and for whatever reason, it didn't happen. And just recently, one little tidbit. Well, no, I should hold that until I get it confirmed. So that's what I would say about the financial. Well, in part of these evidence releases, there is information that strongly suggests that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia was in town that night. Yes, it has been said, but nobody will admit that he was there. Okay, nobody, and so we got from one of our backdoor guys that actually is there, that yes, he was there. In fact, he was there, and there is a second video, because we saw this a while back in one of the videos that Metro released. We saw him there, what appears to be him. And from what I understand, there's a second video that shows him being there. Now, that opens up a whole new avenue of questions as far as, well, what was he doing there? Why was it a secret that he was there? But there is a lot of information out there that would indicate that there was an attempt on his life, because the aftermath that occurred in Saudi Arabia in November of 2017, when they took quite a few of the sheiks into the, I forget what it was, one of the 4-star hotels, and kept them there for a month. And Al Walid, who was a Trump, enemy, who owns part of the Four Seasons, which is above the Mandalay Bay, took him in and hung him upside down for several days, and brought the Blackwater guys in to interrogate him. And at the end of the day, there were a few Saudi princes and whatever. So anyway, what I was saying is that we do have information. We did get information that there is a second video that shows the Crown Prince there. Now, as I said before, in November of 2016, the month after this happened, there was what they're referring to now as the purge in Saudi Arabia, where some of the princes were brought into, I can't remember the 5-star hotel now, the name of it escapes me. But anyway, Al Walid was one of them, Prince Al Walid, who was actually bypassed by the present king, Salman, I believe it is. He bypassed Al Walid and some other people and named his son the Crown Prince. And Al Walid is a part owner of the Four Seasons, which are I believe it's 6 or 8 floors above the Mandalay Bay. So they brought him in among some of these other Saudis, and they hung him upside down. Supposedly they brought Blackwater in to interrogate him. And when this was all said and done, Al Walid was released, but he was also relieved of his duties, official duties as a Saudi Arabian official. So now he's just a normal citizen of Saudi Arabia. He has no function whatsoever in the government, and I think that occurred with some other people, other princes like him. Now, I want to wrap up with this. Khashoggi, okay, the Khashoggi, the journalist who was killed supposedly in Turkey. Okay, now everybody should be reminded that his uncle was the famous Adnan Khashoggi, who was the biggest arms dealer in the Middle East for a very, very, very long time. And whenever you talk about Saudi Arabia, you have to think about bin Laden. You have to think about the Bush crime family being in concert with the bin Ladens. And of course, as you know, I think I've told you that two Saudi princes at two different times, once in the 60s and once in the 80s, infused some money into the shadow government. They basically financed the shadow government, and that created deals with the shadow government so that we would buy our oil from OPEC in the Middle East in exchange for them requiring everyone to use U.S. dollars, and that hence the petrodollar was created. So that whole story. So there's a lot of things that connect into Saudi Arabia that people really aren't aware of, and there's a change in Saudi Arabia that's coming. The Crown Prince is part of that change, and so if he was in Vegas, which all indications appear that he was, and there was an attempt on his life, then that could explain why a lot of this information about what went down in Vegas is being suppressed. Because if you've got Joe Lombardo, the sheriff of Las Vegas, came out at 1:30 in the morning and said, "We've got the shooter. It's all over. He was a lone shooter. He was the only one." I mean, this is the biggest mass shooting in the history of the United States, and Metro had it solved in 2 hours, within 2 hours. Now, so how, I mean, does that not ring a bell? Does that not, do we not get that same kind of quick wrap up on a lot of these kinds of incidents? So, as I said, to me, it appears as if there is a cover up of some kind going on. What it is, we're not sure yet, but getting information like this with the Crown Prince being there would be reason enough for them to suppress some information. And there's a lot of things that they haven't come out with that they should have come out with. For example, the ballistics. I mean, they haven't tied the bullets that they took out of the victims and the deceased to the guns up in 134 and 135, nor have they tied the guns to Paddock from the standpoint of Paddock firing the guns, because they did no tests on Paddock's body, which that's even questionable now. They did no tests on Paddock's body that they identified in the autopsy. They did no gunshot residue tests on him. So if you went to court, if Paddock had survived, let's say, and you went to court and you were going to charge him with murder, you would have a hard time getting a conviction without the ballistics.
A second. So what I want to say is thank you. We're not going to go any further into this, but I think people now, at least they kind of know which direction you're going and how you're kind of hoping to put things together in the future. I do think that it's very possible that the Saudi link is a missing link in Vegas. I also want to say, for people who think that this is idle sort of conjecture or wondering or whatever, that I went to Vegas. I've been there several times, but I actually went to the Mandalay Bay, and in front of the Mandalay Bay are these, as I've told people, these Draco statues that are shocking and wonderful, actually, and they are winged dragons, and you don't see something like that anywhere else, unless maybe you go to China, I don't know, but that's a symbol. It's a major symbol of what's going down. And so you've got Mandalay Bay, you've got the Draco, you've got the MGM lions. So you've got the lion beings, and anyone who knows about my Egypt video, and if you haven't seen my Egypt documentary, of all the beings, humanoid beings with basically, birds, lions, alligators, monkeys. I mean, there's all these beings upright, walking like humans, as well as humanoids type. In Egypt, carved into the temple walls, and giving a message along with that has to do with ascension and so on. So, in other words, we're talking about some very interesting symbolism in Vegas as well, and that we didn't have time to go in that direction. But at some point, if there's reason to, we can bring you back and go have a whole show on just that again. But maybe after some other things have happened in the future, if anything more will start to get revealed, as you say. So, Paladin, it's great to talk to you. I think my audience has really enjoyed it. I've been sort of watching to see if there's any big questions come along. I haven't seen any questions. We've covered a lot of ground. And so we've gone from Kelly to the situation, the financial situation. We've really gone the gamut. So it's been fascinating, and I really appreciate it. Do you just want to say maybe an update on where to find you? What's the status on the White Hat reports? Are we ever going to see any more of those? And I do want to say that if you go to my Project Camelot TV, you will see this post, the Paladin post, has a link to his latest report on it, number 57, or at least the one you're referring to in this discussion. So if you want to read one of those reports or take a look. Paladin?
Yeah, while you're talking about the symbology, and I would suggest everybody go back and listen to I know it's in your archives. It's also in mine, as you were good enough to let me download it and put it on my channel. I talked about the symbology, but it's right across the street from the Luxor, the pyramid, right? So we all know that the pyramids were used for sacrifice back in the day, and also the name of the name of the concert, Harvest Festival. I mean, so come on, this is it. So I would just like to say that we are continuing on with the investigation. We're not going to stop until we figure it all out, and so we'll be making reports now on the White Hats report site. The guys are wanting me to put out some reports based on some of the things that are happening right now, and I'm working on that as we speak. So there will be some improvements to the site. There will be some things that we'll get put up there that will not only cover Vegas, but it'll also cover current events. Also, I think we're going to do a Patreon channel if we can ever get around to it, which I want to do a weekly podcast on White Hat report stuff. I will also put up videos of the White Hat, some White Hat business that we're doing, and also maybe some Las Vegas investigation. So that's some of the things that are coming. I will definitely stay in touch with you and let you know how we're going. I know you're getting ready to go to the UK to have a conference, so I wish you luck over there, and I also wish you luck going through customs at Heathrow.
Okay.
I know how much fun that always is.
Yeah, really, really a nightmare. Thank you. Okay, thanks so much. And everyone, thanks for listening and watching and sticking with us through this. And it's been fascinating, at least from my point of view. So thanks again for watching. I'll be back tomorrow night with Richard Bartlett, Matrix Energetics, and we'll be talking about the nature of reality and healing. So please do tune in tomorrow night for that show. He's a great guest, and I have interviewed him in the past. He's written several books, and he really is quite brilliant. And we talk about physics and the nature of reality. So thanks again for watching, and have a great night.